I wanted to talk a little bit about scaling a remote team, but mostly a remote company because I have unique experience with that, and it's also what I work on today. Um, never practice this presentation. So if it runs long or short, just ask a lot of great questions. Um, as Dennis already said, I am not a co-founder CEO of Remote, which is on remote.com. And before this, I was at GitLab. And when I joined GitLab, we were just four guys. And today GitLab is over 1,100 people. So it's quite a lot of growth. I left about a year ago, almost a year ago to the day. And we never had any offices. So GitLab was remote from day one, and it still is. It doesn't have any offices. Um, and I'm going to give away the conclusion to all of this, which is that remote work scales, and it scales really, really well. It's, I think, one of the most effective ways to grow a company and do it really quickly. And yeah, like I'm giving away the conclusion, but it makes your life so much easier if you're starting a company and if you're growing a company. And there's now ample proof, besides GitLab, there's companies like InVision, Automatic, Elastic, and Zapier that are fully remote, that are very big, that have made a lot of money. They got a lot of investment, but they also actually made a lot of money, and they made great products, and people are happily working there. So there is great proof. And of course, besides these companies that are almost fully remote or almost fully remote, there's many companies like IBM, for instance, where they have thousands of people working remotely. They just don't talk about it as being remote work. It comes under different names, but it's historically something that's been done for a very long time. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when your company grows and I'm assuming here it's a remote only company, or at least a mostly remote or distributed company. What happens and what should you do at each point of the stage? And maybe, I'll teach all of you a little bit about this, and Dennis and Senia as well, maybe when their company becomes 1,100 people. So it scales. Remote scales really well, but it's not easy. And the reason that it's not easy, because scale is never easy. You're always going to encounter strange problems, or problems that are unique to your company, or just problems that always occur when something gets very big. Because with each person that you add to a company, or with each event in the life of a company that makes it bigger, the amount of complexity increases significantly. For a remote organization, this is maybe even more so, because the amount of complexity is very, very, very high. Because there's not just a single scale of you add more people, but more things are going to happen. The most notable one that we all think about when we think about remote work is time zones. So you might not have noticed, but there are 38 different time zones, not 24, because there's time zones that are half an hour or even 45 minutes apart from other time zones. So there's 38 time zones, active time zones, that are actually being used somewhere in the world. So with each time zone, you can imagine that you add 1 point of complexity to how you run your company. Because as people are farther apart, you have to take into account that, maybe you can't have a meeting at a particular time. So this is a very strongly complicating factor. Besides that, of course, the size of the company in terms of employees. I wrote here between 1 and 3.2 million. This 3.2 million is the largest employer in the world, which is the Defense Department of the United States. Probably you're not going to build a company bigger than that, but there's a large range here, and the bigger this becomes, the more complex. And then lastly, countries. So there's about 195 countries. And as I'm learning, especially now that I'm building remote the company, every country has its own rules, its own laws, its own requirements. And the people that live there have their own expectations about what an employer gives them. And so this adds further complexity. So I try to put it in a formula to give an idea of what is the complexity of a particular scale of a distributed company. And, I think if you take the time zones plus the countries and you multiply it by the employees, that is gives you an idea of how complex it is. So if you add employees, it will always get significantly more complex. But in particular, if you add time zones or countries, and those two are separate because you might have everybody in the same time zone. But if many people are in different countries in the same time zone, you still have a lot of additional complexity. But I will go into that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the different sizes of a company. So, and then we're going to take as a metric the amount of people, because this is the way we often think about how big is a company and how complex is a company. And I will juggle a little bit between what I recommend and what I experienced and what I would say you should do or shouldn't do. To start off, when your company is between 1 and maybe up to about 10 people, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what you do, because your company is so small that even though you might feel like you have challenges related to the scale, you might have challenges with some time zones or whatever else, it's always easy to solve where you're in a small group, because it's very easy to get everybody together. If you have an email thread with everybody of the company, you can still calmly read it all. And it's quite easy to solve any issues. So at this point, there's a lot of things you can do. And I'm sure the speakers of yesterday and other speakers of today will talk about the different things you can and should do to optimally run even smaller teams. But if the company as a whole is only this big, problems are solved very easily. And I think that changes really quickly once you go bigger. And I will get into that now. So when you get to about 15 people, this is when your company goes from feeling like a small group of friends, essentially, because you work together very closely, to more feeling like, okay, this is a formal thing. Now we are a formal company. And my first and strongest recommendation in this time is that you should reduce the time zone difference within the team to about 4 hours. So let's take a central point in the planet where maybe most of the team members are now. I would say don't hire people that are more than plus or minus 4 hours from that point. Because if you're so few people, it's unlikely that you can support people that are time zones further away, and they are likely to feel very isolated. This is very tricky, right? Because on one hand, you want to say, well, we building a remote company, we can hire anyone from anywhere, but it's much more hurtful to the individuals and the company as a whole. If you end up hiring someone and they feel alone and isolated from the rest of the team, it makes collaboration more difficult as well. And with a team this small, you can't really support that kind of team. So, and by plus minus 4 hours covers a very large part of the planet. So this is not very restrictive. It's not like hiring in your local neighborhood, which is what we traditionally did. And this is also the point when your company is about 15 people that you really have to start building processes around both documentation and meetings. The thing I always say is that if you talk about working remotely and working asynchronously, is that you should write everything down. This is about the size that you should have processes around that and standardize on, okay, if we do X, then we write it down in place Y. That should be clear to everybody. It should be accessible to everybody. And everybody should understand this and agree with this. You can implement this later, but it's going to be significantly harder to enforce that and to continue with that. At around this stage, and preferably earlier if you can, you make sure that everyone is bought in. It's still inside. It's still easily seen. Like you can still see what everybody's doing. You can still see whether someone is or isn't following along with the processes. Because these first people, they are going to be very important for when the organization grows to spread those same standards to the rest of the organization. Because a few of the people that are in your team now might be engineers, maybe a few others are designers, marketeers, or salespeople. Those people in the future will have larger departments, and having someone with the experience and the diligence of like actually documenting everything and making sure processes are followed is very important. So this will help you very greatly if you start having strict processes and start forming and thinking about these kind of things now. Same regarding meetings. when you're a small team, doing meetings is very easy because you're small, it's easy to coordinate. But as you grow, your meetings will both become much harder to coordinate and set up, but also much harder to manage. Because if you have many people in one meeting, which is a fun thing to do when you run a remote company, just get everyone in a video call, you have to have structure to it. And so you need to build experience and you need to build process to be able to support it in the future. So this is the optimal time to do it because it's starting to become like somewhat useful to do this, but not if you don't do it, your company doesn't break apart. And this is, of course, this is my business, so I'll be plugging this here and there, but this is about the time, and especially depending on how people are located, where you want to employ people directly. So smaller companies or companies that have work with temporary workforce, you can hire everybody as a contractor. And if you do things well, there's no problem with that. If you start to see that you hire several people in a single country, or if you're just seeing that your organization is going to grow significantly over time and you want to have these people full-time employed, you have to start thinking about employing people directly. The reason to do it at this point and not later is because what you don't want to face is you don't want to face having to convert contractors to full-time employees. That's a painful process for everyone. For you as an organization, it's somewhat painful because you have to create new contracts, pay them in a different way, find a solution for that, which again, I have a company that does that, but even if you wouldn't use us, you would still have to find us. But also for the individuals themselves, because if you are a contractor and you're happy being paid as a contract, which is very understandable, right? There's, depending on the country, you might actually evade a lot of taxes. It might be very stressful to have to change to employment, and you might actually lose money. So as an employer, you then have to have a discussion. Well, are we going to pay you more? But it's also going to be more expensive for me as an employer. So my recommendation is that when you get to this kind of scale and you're expecting to grow significantly, just employ people as full-time employees from the get-go, especially if they are in countries where you are already working with other people, because eventually you will need to do that anyway there. Don't give them the option, but employ them as full-time employees so that then it saves you a lot of headaches in the future. There's a lot of asterisks to this. I'm sure we'll get into later. All right. One scale up. So at 15, you have to sort of think about processes, and then you can sort of grow naturally from that point. When you reach 49 people, you're on the threshold of the max amount of people that fit in one Zoom window, which is a very relevant metric, because if you're working remotely, you're most likely to use Zoom because it's the best tool for video calls. You can just put your screen in a grid where you see everybody. So once you're 50 people, you have to press to go to the next page to see everyone. So you can no longer in one view see everybody, which is why, and for the rest of the presentation, I chose the Zoom window as like a metric of scale. This is what it looks like actually. When you have 49 people, this picture comes from Zoom itself. You can still look everybody in the eye, but beyond that, you can no longer. So this is also about the time where what you ideally would want to do is you want to allow growth over time zones. So if you haven't already expanded beyond like the core cluster of time zones where you started out hiring, you now want to start hiring a little bit to the size of it. The perfect way to do this is to grow it evenly. Now, I wouldn't know how you could do that in like a sustainable way, right? It's going to be very hard. You have to be very controlling of where do I allow people, where do I don't allow to hire people. But ideally, you just expand it little by little so that you make sure that no one is ever by themselves in a very isolated time zone. But people are further and further, and they have overlap with the people that are closer to the center. And again, this prepares you for the future, in the future in which you want to be able to say, well, it doesn't matter where you live on the planet, because we have people all over and you will never feel isolated. And sure, there might be clusters, right? If you hire engineers, you might still find them in a particular location very strongly, or more strongly than somewhere else. Or especially if you hire teams that need to speak a particular language, if you look for Portuguese people, you're more likely to find them here in Portugal or in Brazil and not in the middle of China. But making sure that you slowly start to spread the globe in terms of time zones, have people a little bit everywhere, it will allow you to then in the future say, well, it doesn't matter where you live, and you don't need to worry about never meeting any of your colleagues, because there at least will be some colleagues to talk to. And at this point, and this is not unique to remote at all, it's impossible to see what everybody's doing at all times. When you're smaller, this is still very doable. Like if you use a collaboration tool like GitLab, my former employer, you can still see what everybody's doing when you're a somewhat small team. And around this time, even if you were to try it, you cannot keep up with what everybody is doing. And that is quite a difference, especially if you don't have your processes well locked down. So this is why I advised to do this earlier. So if you don't have good processes, this is going to be very painful, because essentially you're going to feel busier and busier and busier to the point of I can't keep up anymore. I mean, the solution for this is one that we've known for centuries, which is that there's management, and you will probably introduce management at this point. I'm sure other people are going to talk about remote, managing people remotely. And I will get back to that as well. But this is essentially the point at which you'll actually have to think about that, how I'm going to structure my teams and hierarchy. And then operationally, what you want to do is you want to set high-level standards for employment, salary, and benefits. And the reason for that is that now that your team is bigger, you can't just make up whatever the salary, whatever the benefits are, however we're going to employ someone in any particular location for each hire. You want to standardize those things, and you want to set a high-level standards. You might not pay everybody the same salary. You might not even pay everybody within the same range, but you should make a decision about how are you going to approach this, because as you grow, a few things are going to happen. One, you might hire more people at the same time, so you should be able to quickly give an answer for this. You want this to become predictable, and you want to also have some standardization across your organization. You don't want to fall in a pitfall where your employees, of course, everybody talks with each other. They find out that they have very wildly different benefits or very wildly different salary. And setting some standards will save you a lot of stress in the long run. And the same with employment and everything else. And then, when I talk about like what is difficult about remote work, I think this is always one of the biggest challenges, which is bonding. Because if you're a small team, again, when you're small, everything is easy and everybody talks with everybody and everybody gets to know everybody. But if you get bigger, it's much easier for someone to fall out of the daily chatter or to isolate themselves because maybe they are not as inclined to speak up in a meeting, or they happen to miss a few meetings. So as an organization, you have to move from, well, people get to know each other by accident and they get to bond just because they happen to work together, to more actively thinking about it and more actively making plans about how are we going to scale people actually getting to know each other. This is very difficult, and there are many different solutions for this, many different tools. My advice is that you try them all and you see what works. What we do at Remote is we have a daily team call where most of the time we spend on bonding and discussing things with each other, or we have a question of the day where we ask everybody to answer a random question that someone came up with. So today the question was, what is your ideal way to start the day? There's many different ways. That one in particular I know works because we used it at GitLab, but as you scale, you might have to employ different strategies there as well. It's very important. All right. Between 49 and about 147 people, a big change happens in the organization. So 47, 3 times 49. A big change happens because you go from being a company where you can know everybody to a company that is bigger than what you can oversee, even in terms of people. This is what it looks like. It's now 3 pages of Zoom, which is quite a lot, right? Because, you might be joining the Zoom call and you be thinking, oh, I wonder where my colleague is that I just work with, or I want to see the background of this particular person. Now you have to look through 3 pages to find that person. And in my experience, sometimes you change the page, but you rarely ever do it. So in other words, most of the calls, if everybody were to join the call, you would see only a minority of the amount of people in the company. So yeah, you don't know everyone anymore. You can't. You can really work hard on it, but people wouldn't be able to do their work. At this point in time, you have to start to worry about what happens with people in different departments, in different teams that will never meet each other unless you force them to meet. For instance, you see this, of course, in office. If you have a typical company which has a single floor in a building, for example, when you're about this size, everybody is still on the same floor, and someone in design might walk through sales and still meet people there or have lunch with them together. But in a remote organization, that doesn't happen. So you have tools like Donut, which is a Slack bot that automatically puts two people together at random, and then like tells them, oh, you should have a coffee chat and you should talk about something. Those kind of tools are amazing for this stage of the company because it prevents you from having groups of people clustered and being fully isolated from other clusters of people. This is also a little bit the difficult time, because even if you've grown the time zones, your company is not big enough to form teams based around a set of time zones. Like, it's unlikely that all your designers are all clustered in the same time zone, and you're not big enough to have so many designers that you could just take a group of designers that are close enough in time zone. This is actually very tricky time, and I think this is also one of the times where most companies, for instance, I can tell directly from GitLab, we had a plurality of people in the United States. So we had some people that were in Australia and someone in Japan. They felt a little bit isolated, even though we had a lot of people in Europe and some other people in Asia as well. That was a small minority. And this size of the company this is very tricky, because it might be that there are some people that feel isolated, and which is why it's so important that you gradually grow over time zones. If you do all hands meetings like the Zoom that I showed you just now, this might be the time that you split it in two, right? There might be enough people so that you can actually find a time that is reasonable for about half of the people in the organization. And then you split those meetings in two. Of course, it depends on what you mean to achieve with those meetings, whether it's possible. But what is not possible and not doable is that if you have a daily meeting where many of your employees have to join in the middle of the night, unless they prefer that, of course. At this time, also, finance, dealing with different currencies, dealing with international payroll and benefits is a full-time job, or more than a full-time job. Again, my company solves this. Today we solve it for about 4 countries. By the end of the quarter for about 10, and by the end of the year for about 30. But as I said, there's 195 countries in the world, and I intend that we solve it for all of those countries, but it's going to take us a while. So if you have a company of this size today, you're facing it. Either way, this is a challenge. This is the reason why I built remote, because I saw that there's no good solution to solving the issue of, well, there's governments with borders, and they all have their own rules, and they all have their own wishes and things that they want. It's almost infinitely complex, which is why it's such a strong factor to consider. This might also be a reason for you to decide, well, we're not going to hire in certain jurisdictions in certain countries because employing people there is too complex, or it is not feasible for us, which, although a big shame, would totally be understandable. On the other side, on the flip side, is that you're now a big company, right? Like by this time, when you have about 150 people, you're a bigger company. So you're going to attract different people that are not necessarily interested in working in a high-risk startup that's likely to fail within the next year. No, if you're 150 people, you're a bit of a bigger company, and people that apply to your company will have higher expectations, in particular of benefits, right? So I remember when I joined GitLab, I didn't even think about whether there was a pension plan, because of course there wasn't, because we were just 4 or 5 guys. But of course, if you join a company with already 150 people, and that company, employs other people in the same country, you would expect that you would at least get the standard benefits that people would normally get. And that is something to take note of as you expand, because even though you might be hiring someone in a country where you haven't hired before, they might be expecting this. And then in collaboration is what I said earlier. You now have multiple larger teams, and the siloing of those teams becoming isolated from all the other teams, is a real big risk. And it can actually be beneficial in some ways, right? You want departments or teams to operate independently, but that can come at the cost of collaboration between the teams, which is eventually is necessary as you all are a single company. And tools like Donut help teams bonding and having like out of normal work traffic communication, which can help a lot with this. All right. Yeah, and I see someone in the comments mention the Dunbar number. I explicitly didn't mention it because of all the weak scientific foundation for the Dunbar number and the many different numbers that are thrown out there. But yeah, at the Dunbar number, you're unable to know everybody anymore. So at 294, so about 300 people, that's a lot of Zoom windows. Now you are at a really big organization. I think, at least in my experience, for GitLab, it didn't feel like such a big jump as the prior jump. Like going from 50 to 150 feels like really big change, and from 150 to about 300, everything just gets harder and bigger. But it not necessarily, it didn't feel very differently to me. But to give you an impression, now if you were a normal company and you would be all in one big building, you would now have multiple floors in the building. It's just that when you work remotely and you are covering multiple time zones, now everybody is working different hours. So you're going to have layers of management. And with layers of management, you're going to have a high risk of very long cycle times. What you can't have is that someone asks a question and then the answer only comes 2-3 days later. Imagine someone that is reporting up to a manager that reports up to the director, but then needs approval from a vice president. If they're all in different time zones, it can take a very long time to get an answer. So to collaborate, what should happen is that departments act like little distributed companies. Most remote working tools that are specific for remote work, they do not scale to 300 people. So rather departments or teams, they adopt their own tools rather than, all trying to use the same tools at the same time. And this is also the point where you can start building teams with narrower time zone restrictions. So what I said earlier, you couldn't do it around 150, you start to be able to do right now, where you say, well, the team that works on a particular feature of the product, they are all central or located around a particular time zone. And it will make it easy for them to collaborate and to ship faster. Now, the last step, when you are bigger than 500 people as a remote organization, you are in uncharted territory. There are a few companies like GitLab and Envision and Automatic that have a lot of remote employees, but that's just a small number of companies. And the knowledge that those companies have, although they do a great job of sharing that and being very transparent, is limited to just their own experience and is very limited in comparison with the experience that history has with running a normal organization of that size, where there's millions of companies that have grown this big. And now we're talking about a handful. And it means for you that if you are running one of these organizations, that you will have to figure out what works for you. And that you can read GitLab's handbook, for example, to see how they function and how they work, but you're going to come across a lot of unique problems to your organization being remote and being very, very large. So there's actually not a lot I can say to you, but everything will just get harder. You'll have to be very inventive here. I find this very interesting, of course, but I actually can't tell you anything because there is so little that is like that we have experience with. Even GitLab only has been this size for about a year and a half, right? Before that, it was until 300 people. So, and now I'm gonna round up now. At any scale that you're building a remote organization, it's not the tools that are a problem, because you hear many new tools coming up, but they're also not the solution. Tools are absolutely necessary to run and continuously people are building awesome new tools, and I love to see it, but they are not the solution to running and scaling a remote organization. At the same time, what we see is that demand for remote work is way greater than the supply. That means that if you're starting a remote organization, hiring is 10 times easier, maybe 100 times easier, because everybody wants a remote job. It's such a huge plus to work remotely. And I think everybody that has or wants to understands it very well. And that means that, as a distributed company, you have way greater access to scaling capabilities. It's much easier to grow your company quickly, which is what we did at GitLab, where we went from 1 year from 40 to 150, next year from that to 300, and then from 500 to 1100 in a single year. Now, of course, this leads me to why I'm building the company that I'm building, is because how do you actually find and interview and hire and employ and then do all the other things that you need to do when you want to employ someone when they come from anywhere? And so what we try to do is we try to solve a small piece of this puzzle. You still have to do the interviewing and finding people and everything else, but what we are working on is trying to solve at least the employment bit, so that you can employ anyone from anywhere legally and compliant and meeting the local labor laws, and basically take that complexity out of your hands. You still have to do everything else. So all the challenges that I spoke about, we can solve those for you, but this is the little bit that we are working on.